probably need to get further down the road with some of those reforms to make that assessment. Mm-hmm. Like, how much of all this is on a sliding scale, like a matter of degree? I mean, that was the tough part for me with, I think, a lot of the yes or no stuff was that, you cited Norway as being a socialist country, but there's some capitalism there, right?
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, so, one way, for example, when we are talking about countries, you can talk about the degree to which they're socialized, say, through the percent of national wealth owned by the government. And Norway is a country where something like 55% of the national wealth, at least like as of 2014, was owned by the government. That's a lot. So, yeah, I do think you do have to talk about it. There's no yes socialist, not socialist. Like, I don't think that makes sense. But I think as a person, or sort of as your own politics, what sort of makes you a socialist or not a socialist is that the direction that we want to move in towards 100% nationalization, towards the state owning and people collectively controlling all of this property? Or do you not actually want that to happen? Do you sort of pull back and stop short and say, we think that there still should be private property that the demos does not have control over? I think that's what distinguishes a socialist from not a socialist, or at least a very major thing.
As opposed to a country which is more on a degree.
Yeah, I don't think it makes sense to as soon as we start talking about that, you start drawing arbitrary lines like, okay, what percentage of national wealth makes a country socialist? And some people have tried to do that before, but I don't think it really makes sense.
I see. Okay, because and give me a sense of like what that 55. I mean, because if I was to say like, well, I have no problem with 55%, let's say. I mean, I don't know what that constitutes in the context of Norway, but when I've always like thought about, I mean, for me, I tend to think of politics just like almost exclusively based upon outcomes. Mm-hmm. And so for me, like, I would like to see energy production. I would like to see the internet. I would like to see at least payments of healthcare, and I think probably maybe even delivery of healthcare ultimately nationalized. Mm-hmm. I don't know where I'm at now at that point in terms of like what that constitutes in terms of government, control of wealth at that point. But I gotta think that's close to energy, healthcare,
transportation,
in terms of like public transport or cars. Which one? I would say it's certainly public transport, like Amtrak and
do you think, like, would you like to see, okay, so for example, the government's already building highways, right? Like, we already have this elaborate system of roads that the government has created for the explicit purpose of letting people use cars and travel all over the place. So it's really more of a question here of, okay, well, how is the government going to deliver on this goal of being able to move people around or being able to facilitate that? And I think that once you ask that question, you say, I say, well, whatever makes sense. Whatever the majority of people decide makes sense. But the people should be able to decide that through the state. It shouldn't be left up to some random automaker who's just interested in his own profits making that decision. Because when that happens, you end up with all kinds of very strange situations like, people delaying conversion to clean, to electric cars and things like that. I think so. It's often a question like that of, okay, well, do you think that running this, is there a sensible way for this industry to be run? And why should any particular person be able to say, I think it should be run unsensibly if the majority of people disagree?
But don't we have the ability right now through the state to do like cafe standards and to say like, couldn't we say tomorrow, by, you guys got 5 years and it has to be all electric?
There are all kinds of restrictions to the government's ability to regulate things, and they'll take you to court and say that's unconstitutional.
But we do that, don't we? I mean, haven't we set cafe standards? So we set, it's just a question of we could say, if we can say you need to have your fleet of cars needs to be average 40 miles per gallon, let's say. I don't know exactly what it is. It was just raised. 40 miles gallon. And if we can say 40 miles a gallon, we could say you know what? Your fleet of cars needs to be 70 miles a gallon.
Yeah.
At that point, they're going to go, it's just easier for us to convert to electric. I mean, it's conceivable to me that we could say your fleet of cars needs to be 200 miles per gallon, which, essentially is saying you can have a little bit of, fossil fuel in there if you want, but it has to be electric beyond that. I mean, we have the ability to do that today.
Mm-hmm. So we do. It's more complicated than that. When you try to impose these regulations, it depends on what kind of regulation you're trying to impose. And there are various tests that get applied for, is this reasonable or is this not? And a lot of times you'll just have one or two judges who sit there and decide, okay, this is in the public interest. In my opinion. And so if the majority of people disagree with this one judge, they have no choice. And it gets the regulation gets thrown out and it can't be applied because one judge has decided it's not in the public interest. One judge decides that, okay, these environmental standards, they're too onerous. They would hurt the bottom line of this company too much to be imposed on it. So I don't think that it's appropriate for us to impose these. We're throwing them out. And that kind of thing happens a lot.
No, without a doubt. Believe me. I mean, and we have, I think we're going to have a Supreme Court that's going to basically say, in the context of making that assessment, specific to this, the EPA, I think they've reversed that Trump rule about making that cost benefit analysis, but it could very well be inhibited by the Supreme Court. So a socialist country necessarily gets rid of judges that will assess. So how do we make sure that there's an efficiency of the country saying? And I don't know if in this country we would actually, frankly, we would all vote for, let's say, an all-electric fleet of cars, but it is what it is at that point. How do we make sure that the will of the people is so efficiently manifested in our elected officials?
I think that there's a lot of room for disagreement there, and I think that's essentially an administrative problem. How do we organize a government like this? So, for example, I think that having a Senate, which is based on this principle of protecting land ownership rather than people, I don't think it makes sense to have a kind of legislature like that. I do think that some kind of representative legislature does make sense. Subject to elections and things like that. I think there are a lot of cases where direct democracy would be silly to solve that. I don't think that, frankly, a lot of people would want to be involved in direct democracy trying to solve a lot of questions. But the bottom line is there some way that, and some very reasonable way that people can, if they really want to, make this decision about how the economy should be run, how this piece of property should be managed, and they're able to enact it through the state. I think that a lot of cases we don't.
If I don't believe that if there is like a way to efficiently do that, is it impossible for me to be a socialist?
I think that, so what I would say is I think most people do think that there is a way for the economy to be managed reasonably. Most Americans tend to think that, yeah, we have this system in place that does it. And so a lot of the controversy here about how you structure representation, like I said, is administrative. If you think that's just absolutely impossible, that sounds to me like the concept of governance is not possible, that we can't do that. And that is, I suppose that is a serious objection. I don't think that you could call yourself a socialist in this case. You would probably call yourself some kind of anarchist or whatever.
I just don't know that we can do it. I just don't know that we can have a system that is ever really going to efficiently communicate that. With that type of consolidation of power, that's my only concern. That's a big concern for me. I mean, for me, like, the thing I like about a 55% type of situation is that on the whole, I think that I am really skeptical that capitalism can eliminate worker exploitation, but I'm also concerned about all sorts of different systems not being exploitive in some fashion or another, or being, and so the closer we can get to some measure of tension, that I'm in favor of. It's not inconceivable to me that we get to 55% and I'm like, oh, 75% is looking pretty good from this 55% vantage. I guess maybe I'm in that respect,
I would say that sort of a persistent socialist position on this is that if you do not get to 100%, if you keep private capital and you keep the little concentrations of power that come with private capital, that eventually that 45% that is private property starts growing and taking back stuff from the commons, like we've seen all over the world, privatizing. And so in the end, you're kind of picking your poison in a sense, right? Do you want to be managed by these unaccountable corporations, or do you want to give democratic management a shot?
I think that last point you made about, any of it, if you leave any of it alive, it can metastasize is I think a fairly strong point. I mean, that is always that. I mean, and that is, then you look at something like, Piketty, and you see that maybe we're just reverting to the mean in some respect. But
well, Carl, on that point, would leaving certain things in, like, I'm thinking about media versus the oil industry, for instance, right? Like, like having some distance between the state, and I don't, I'm pretty much supportive of the state intervening, but is there anything in terms of like that you would stress or emphasize?
Do you mean in terms of what the media, how the government would control the media? I'm not quite sure I understand the question.
Oh, sorry. I muted myself for a second there. Yeah, I guess I think I'm generally of the like you can't leave any of it, but I think there is a difference between leaving like the oil industry versus leaving media as, you know, maybe a carve out, maybe because we have some sort of new version of the First Amendment after the revolution where, you know, media is not as controlled by the state. But I don't know. What do you have any thoughts on distinctions between industries like that?
Yeah. So I think like, so for the media, we have this idea that